The air in the makeshift field hospital was thick with the smell of blood, antiseptic, and fear. It was a smell Ludmila Pavlichenko knew intimately, a terrible perfume that clung to her skin and uniform. Outside the tent, the earth-shaking thunder of German artillery never ceased. It was June 1941, near Odessa, and the world was coming apart. Men she had just bandaged would be carried back in pieces hours later. The line of stretchers never seemed to shorten. She was a history student from Kiev, a nurse now by terrible necessity, her hands skilled at mending, at soothing, at closing eyes. But with each new wave of broken boys, a cold, hard knot tightened in her stomach. It was a feeling of utter helplessness. She could stitch a wound, but she could not stop the bullet that made it. One afternoon, a young soldier, no older than her brother, gripped her wrist with a bloodied hand. His eyes were wide, glazing over. "Sister," he whispered, his breath a ragged gasp. Why couldn't they stop them? Why? He died before she could form an answer. That question, etched in his dying gaze, haunted her. It circled in her mind that night as she tried to sleep on a thin bedroll, the echoes of shells her lullaby. The next morning, she saw a group of Red Army scouts returning from the front. One had a long, sleek Mosin-Nagant rifle slung across his back. Ludmila stared at it. An idea, both terrifying and clear, formed. The tools of healing were not enough. To truly save her people, she would have to learn the tools of killing. She walked past the rows of groaning wounded, past the surgeons with their tired eyes, and straight to the recruitment office. The officer behind the desk looked at her slight frame, her intelligent face, and snorted. "You could be of better use in the hospital, girl." She met his gaze without blinking. "I have a clear eye and a steady hand. I was a history student. I understand cause and effect. Give me a rifle." He shook his head, but she stood there, unmoving. Perhaps it was the unnerving stillness in her, so different from the panic around them, that made him relent. He shoved a form across the desk. "Fine, the 25th Rifle Division. You'll be a sniper, they say. We'll see." Her training was brutal and brief. The other men, raw recruits, scoffed at the little nurse. But when she took her first shot on the range, the instructor fell silent. Her hands, trained for delicate surgical work, were preternaturally steady. Her mind, used to focused study, calculated wind and distance with calm precision. The hospital had given her a stomach for horror, but it was her father's childhood lessons in the woods, hunting for food, not sport, that whispered back to her. The rifle became an extension of her will. 2 weeks later, she was on a rocky hillside overlooking a German advance. The smell was different here, cordite, dirt, and pine, but the fear was the same now, a sharp personal thing in her own throat. Through her scope, she saw not faceless enemies, but men, one lighting a cigarette, another laughing. Her finger trembled on the trigger. The ghost of the young soldier from the hospital appeared in her mind. Why couldn't they stop them? She exhaled, half a breath, and the rifle cracked. The man with the cigarette fell. There was no triumph, only a hollow, seismic shift within her. Ludmila the nurse was gone. On that hillside, Ludmila the sniper was born. The war became a different kind of hospital, a vast, open-air ward where her duty was not to heal but to triage the enemy advance. Ludmila operated in the gray space between the lines, a world of mud, freezing trenches, and unbearable tension. She learned to become a ghost. She would lie for hours in a shell crater or a makeshift hide, her body freezing, muscles screaming, never moving. The patience of a nurse, waiting for a fever to break, translated into the sniper's lethal patience. Her first spotter, a gruff veteran named Corporal Malenko, watched her with grudging curiosity. "You don't shoot like you're angry," he muttered one day after she'd taken down a German machine gun crew, methodically picking them off one by one to silence the deadly nest. "No," she replied, her eyes never leaving her scope. "I shoot like I'm performing an operation. You remove the diseased part to save the body." Her tally rose, but each mark in her logbook was a weight. She remembered faces, small details, an officer adjusting his glasses, a soldier showing a photograph to his comrade. She compartmentalized these memories, locking them away in a part of her mind she dared not visit. Her reputation began to seep through the ranks. The little nurse was now whispered about as Lady Death. The title sickened her. She was not death, she was a shield. Her precise fires saved Soviet patrols from ambush, allowed wounded to be retrieved, broke up mortar teams preparing barges. One bitterly cold day near Sevastopol, her role blurred terribly. A Soviet assault on a German position had gone wrong. Men were pinned down in a gully, wounded screaming under a sniper's fire. From her perch, Ludmilla identified the German sniper's position, a clever hide in a shattered farmhouse chimney. It was a duel. For 3 hours, neither moved. She ignored the cold seeping into her bones, the cramp in her leg. She thought of the field hospital, of the specific agony a high-velocity bullet could cause. Finally, a tiny shift, a glint of sunlight on a scope lens. She fired once. The German sniper's rifle clattered from a perch. The assault could continue. Later, crawling back to her own lines, she vomited in the snow. It was the first time she had killed not just a soldier, but a mirror image of herself. Malenko found her. He didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, he handed her a piece of hard bread. "You saved 12 men in that gully today, Pavlichenko. 12 mothers' sons. Remember that number, not the other one." It was a nurse's logic, and it was the only thing that kept her sane. Sevastopol was hell made earthly. The siege dragged on for months, a relentless meat grinder of steel and fire. Ludmilla's world shrank to the crumbling stone of the city, the labyrinth of trenches, and the ever-closing ring of German forces. Her snipers count past 100, then 200. The numbers, once horrifying, became a strange, abstract scorecard of survival. Each shot meant one less weapon firing on her comrades, a few more hours, another day the city held. The personal cost was immense. Malenko was killed by a mortar blast while scouting a position for her. She carried his blood-stained map in her pocket until the paper disintegrated. Friends in her unit vanished, replaced by hollow-eyed strangers. The constant shelling was a form of madness. Yet, within this chaos, her legend solidified. The High Command learned of her. She was given a better rifle, a scoped SVT-40, and orders to train others. She found herself teaching young men, their hands shaking, how to breathe, how to see, how to separate themselves from the act. "You are not a man pulling a trigger," she would say, her voice low and steady. "You are a surgeon. The battlefield is the body. Your target is the infection. Do not hate the germ. Simply remove it." Her own resolve was tested in fire. During a German push, her position was overrun. She and 2 trainees fought their way through crumbling buildings, using her knowledge of the city's sewers and ruins to escape. In a close-quarter gunfight in a shattered bakery, she killed a German soldier with her pistol at point-blank range. His face, young and terrified, would join her gallery of ghosts. The final days of Sevastopol were a nightmare. Evacuation was the only option. As she boarded a cramped submarine under cover of darkness, the sky behind her glowing red from the fires of the fallen city, Ludmilla felt not like a hero, but like a survivor abandoning a patient on the table. She was wounded herself, shrapnel in her cheek, but the deeper wound was the defeat. The submarine slipped away, and she sat in the metallic darkness, the smell of oil and sweat replacing cordite. A young sailor recognized her. "Is it true?" he asked on his voice. "The 300? She looked at him, her eyes empty. "It is true that we have left Sevastopol," she said quietly, and turned away. The war was not over. It had simply changed its address. The wound on her face was still healing when the summons came. She was to travel to Moscow and then to America and Great Britain. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a symbol. The Red Army wanted the world to see the face of Russian resistance, and it was hers, a young, serious woman who had traded a nurse's cap for a sniper scope. Ludmilla hated it. She felt like a museum exhibit, a propaganda doll. In a crisp new uniform that felt like a costume, she met her minders, who gave her speeches to memorize. Talk about the fascist beasts, they instructed. Talk about your confirmed kills. She disembarked in Washington, D.C. to a blizzard of flashbulbs and shouting reporters. The questions were shallow, sensational. Do you use makeup on the battlefield? What do you think of American men? She seethed inside, but maintained a cool, dignified silence. Then, she met Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady was not what she expected. She was tall, gracious, and listened with genuine depth. At a private lunch, Mrs. Roosevelt asked not about tactics or numbers, but about her life before the war. Ludmilla spoke of Kiev University, of studying history, of wanting to be a teacher. For a moment, she was just a young woman again, lost in a memory of libraries and quiet. And the war changed that path, Mrs. Roosevelt said softly. It was not a question. Yes, Ludmilla replied, her voice thick. Now I teach a different lesson. The public speeches were agonizing, but she found her own voice. Standing before huge crowds in Chicago and New York, she ignored the prepared texts. She spoke of the reality she had seen. I'm a soldier. I have killed 309 fascist invaders. But behind every number is a life I did not want to take. I was a student. I wanted to create. Now I must destroy, because the enemy has brought this destruction to my land. They are on our soil. How many of your sons would it take to do what I have done? How many of your daughters would have to pick up a rifle? The crowds fell silent, then erupted. She was no longer a curious sideshow. She was a stark, powerful voice for the immense human cost of the war and the urgent need for a second front in Europe. In England, she toured bomb-ravaged cities, seeing a different kind of civilian courage. She spoke to factory workers, to women just like her, who were also fighting the war in their own way. The propaganda tour, to her surprise, became a new front. She was using words as bullets, aiming them at public opinion, try to wound isolationism and kill complacency. She returned to Russia not just as Lieutenant Pavlichenko, but as a figure of international renown. The quiet, deadly ghost of Sevastopol had become a global voice. The weight was immense, but she carried it. The war was not yet won. The war moved on, and Ludmilla moved with it, promoted to major and tasked with training a new generation of snipers. She stood on a quiet stretch of front near the Baltic, a world away from the crumbling heat of Sevastopol. Before her was a class of young faces, male and female, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. She saw herself in them, the history student turned nurse, the nurse turned soldier. She did not start with ballistics. She started with a story. I was once a nurse, she began, her voice carrying easily in the cold air. I learned that to save a life, you must sometimes cause pain. To stop a greater evil, you must sometimes perform a terrible act. This rifle, she hefted her SVT-40, is a tool of last resort. It is not for glory. It is for saving your comrades, your villages, your country. You must be precise. You must be calm. You must never, ever enjoy it. She taught them everything Malenko had taught her, everything the war had burned into her soul. The art of stillness, the science of the wind, the psychology of the hunt. She taught them to make gloves from grass and twine, to chew their bread slowly to avoid swallowing too loudly, to see the landscape not as terrain, but as a diagram of angles and cover. One night, a talented young trainee named Anya, who had been a biology student, confessed she was terrified of her first assignment. What if I freeze? What if I see his face? Ludmilla put a hand on her shoulder. You will see his face, and you will remember it. But you will also see the faces of the people in the village he might burn, the comrades his mortar might hit. Carry both. The second set is why you pull the trigger. In the spring of 1944, during a massive Soviet offensive, Ludmilla found herself again near the front, not as an active sniper, but as an advisor. From a command post, she watched through binoculars as a company was stalled by a hidden German nest. She directed a pair of her snipers, talking them calmly through the shot over the field telephone. When the nest fell silent, the advance resumed. It was a different kind of contribution, but no less vital. The tide had truly turned. The battles were now of movement, not siege. When the news of victory finally came in May 1945, the explosion of joy across the Soviet Union was something she observed from a quiet distance. The celebrations felt surreal, belonging to a different species of people, those who had not had to curate a gallery of the dead in their mind. The war was over, but her battle was not. The ghosts remained. She returned to Kiev University, not as a student, but as a historian. She completed her degree, her thesis focusing on medieval Ukrainian statehood, a deep dive into a time of creation, not destruction. She married, had a son, and worked as a military historian and researcher. She rarely spoke of the war publicly. When asked about her record, she would deflect. I did my duty, like millions of others. In her later years, walking through the peaceful streets of Kiev, the smell of lilac sometimes replacing the phantom smells of cordite and field hospitals, she would think of the long, terrible arc of her life. She had been shaped by history, then had stepped into its bloody current to try and change its course. She had been a healer, a killer, a symbol, and, finally, a teacher again. The rifle was stored away, a relic in a museum. The nurse, however, never truly retired. In the quiet of the archives, surrounded by books and the peaceful dust of the past, Lyudmila Pavlichenko finally found a front line where she could lay down her weapons and tend once more to the future.